assert its dominance via imposing unequal, unfair trade in goods and ideas. Healthy trade is a two-way affair. But the glee of dominating gives way to anxiety when the dominated starts claiming equal privileges. This results in pushing back, revealing the colonial face of the operation. This has always been the case. First, entry by the colonized into the imperial land is discouraged. Then admittance is allowed based upon need and skills, but with reluctance to offer the same treatment. The system may relent only in rare cases where parties may have a global visibility, thus yielding a positive in the net cost-benefit analysis. In colonies, training is extended to the native to facilitate administrative work, but only limited opportunities are offered in life that follows. The colonizing agenda has had at least three identifiable factors. One, the zeal to civilize the native, deemed by nature savage, perverse, lazy, and incapable. Two, the cunning to train the native to make them into useful workers. Three, the tendency to use the native as an object of scientific study for observation, experimentation, and measurements. These were more like strategies to justify colonial rule than philanthropic in nature. In Satadru's words, these steps were aimed to render disorderly, disobedient, and unproductive natives into orderly, obedient, and productive subjects, and validate the modernity and morality of the colonizers. Maintaining the distance between the colonizer and the native has always been crucial. In India, English education was offered to the natives to rescue them from their own cultural weaknesses and to bring them, again to use Satadru's words, morally, socially, and politically closer to Britain, but without compromising the hierarchies of race and national identity. British anxieties with this education were rooted in the precariousness of the balance between imperial embrace and colonial rejection. That is, the ever-present danger that the lines separating Indian men from English men and Indian men from English women would all be compromised, unquote. In French Vietnam, people from Pondicherry were welcomed to work and settle there. The Pondicherry Decree of September 1881 gave Indians in Vietnam the right to renounce their Indian status to be full French citizens. They had to take on French surnames for this. The French found them useful as government servants since they were educated in French medium schools in Pondicherry. The new citizens too looked forward to living on equal terms with the French. However, Saigon was unwilling to treat them the same as the French. Speaking French and bearing French surnames did not make them French. By law, Indian renouncers held the same status as the French, but it was different in real life. Thus, for the colonized, exceptions are made only if it benefits the giver. All kinds of factors come into play at this stage, of which the taker's color, plus the benefit to the giver, are the most significant to determine the extent of allowable integration. Insubordinates are promptly put back in place. Think of the model minority in this context. In Satadru's words, the model minority is a model of apolitical citizenship, which allows the majority to bury its history and politics of racism, a constricting model of citizenship that emphasizes docility, not challenging the prerogatives of the majority, unquote. The experience of the colonized, thus, is essentially one of being discriminated against, or being put back in place by a power that thinks of itself as superior. It can happen in our own country or in another country. To be colonized is to be dehumanized and exploited in a particular political context, to be brutalized by our own countrymen or others on account of other unjust hierarchies may not feel exactly like the colonial situation. Decolonization is assertion of freedom from discrimination, laying claims to equal treatment, making the case for not just tolerance but respect. It is stopping purposeful deculturization and demanding free exchange of knowledge. And this will work only when such respect flows naturally from within and not just because it is required by law, although the latter is supremely important. Compulsion, to some extent, does help internalization. Without the internalization of what the law seeks to provide, progress doesn't happen. The minds of the common people must be unblocked for systemic racism to end. Decolonization also involves a restructuring of the colonial psyche, colonized psyche, afflicted with a lingering inferiority complex, a die-hard combination of awe, rage, and hate. Overcoming it needs work. The most essential tool to win decolonization is, perhaps, faith in the colonizer's humanity. We cannot dehumanize the other party in order to stop their dehumanization of us without violating our basic principle. If we have no faith in the ability of the other party to relate to us, we can achieve nothing without violence. Undoubtedly, the trust of the indigenous has been violated too many times by the colonizer. Yet pathways to friendship must be discovered. It's true that men like DeRozio or David Hare have been rare, but they did exist. Many of us have friends, teachers, and even family to validate this faith in people who are on the other side of the line of control. I know I have some, and Satadru had some. Alternatives to the exchange of hate exist and must be sought out. However, seeking unity with all humanity brings obligations of enormous proportions. It brings the burden of shared responsibility for any wrong that any human being may commit. For no one is born and brought up in a total isolation. We are all products as we are agents. One person's wrongdoing means we have all gone wrong somewhere, somehow. Unless we are ready to bear this burden, we may not talk about unity at all, nor may we bask in the glory of anyone in the world. Our children's, our heroes, our kind, the humankind. We may not claim anything as world heritage unless we are ready to share in the world's sin. Group unity is divisive. It may be necessary as a stage in a journey, but must eventually expand towards a bigger unity. Otherwise, it will never bring any lasting good. I'm not a historian. My references to Satadru are far from those of a professional historian. What I have said voices the impressions left on me by his work and our conversations. But this much I know, that he did harbor in him both the courage and the faith that I have been referring to. His faith allowed him to have hope even in the darkest of hours. Satadru was also strict on accountability. He believed acknowledging responsibility is the first step to doing better. At the same time, he was aware of the limits of responsibility of our existential conditions. He acknowledged that not everything wrong can be fixed. This combination allowed him to feel compassion and contentment, and yet insist on growth and experience frustration at lack of sincerity and honesty. Unity was a value for Satadru only when it did not lapse into fascist demands for uniformity stoked by majoritarianism. Only as long as oneness served the cause of difference. The diverse are valued when we see some commonality between them and us. We claim the same treatment for the different and special treatment for the very different, precisely because they are and are not the same as us. Because they too are human beings, albeit sometimes with different conditions. I remember having many conversations with him on this. The human mind is deep enough. In fact, Satadru pointed to the human fascination for the rare and the exotic, which often creates an enchantment, a majoritarian romance of the minority. The charm of the unknown, the new, the different is a part of ourself, and more prosaically also sustains the travel industry. Satadru urged people to seek out the basis of tolerance and minority rights within this pool of romanticism buried inside the majoritarian nationalism itself. As he said, majoritarian romance is a resource that deserves to be taken seriously and better utilized in everyday discourse and practice. I want to end by saying that Satadru lived his life in the light of these realizations. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, Professor, over to you.
Thank you. I would like to thank the Presidency University for organizing this lecture. But more than anything else, I would like to thank Professor Korobi Sen for the opportunity to speak to all of you, for making it possible for decolonization as a theme to be taken forward. It's not always that these kind of memorial lectures are instituted. So thank you very much, Professor Sen. And I'm really grateful to you and to Presidency University for this opportunity. Now, my own discipline, as has already been said, is ancient history and archaeology. I am not a historian of modern India, but what I would like to talk about and what I think might strike a chord with Professor Sen and would also be an adequate memorial lecture to Professor Satadru Sen is the decolonization of the mind. How do we decolonize our own selves from ideas which we have inherited and ideas which we continue to circulate and continue to talk about? So it is with that in mind that I decided to choose the theme of Borobudur and the theme of how do we read monuments? How were these monuments read in an earlier period? What have we inherited? Have we gone beyond that? Or do we continue to talk about in the same vein as, say, about 100 years ago? So it is really with that that I would like to share my screen and would like to begin my lecture. So I hope my screen would be visible to you. Sorry, just one second.
Yes.
Is that all right? Okay, so what I have chosen to talk about are two things. One is decolonizing. And when I talk about decolonizing, I'm looking at decolonizing of ideas, of the narratives that we have inherited, and the need, as Professor Sen said, the need to do rigorous research to move beyond into different trajectories rather than regurgitating what is already available. The second theme that's of interest to me is maritime heritage. Again, this is an underworked theme, as all of you know, you are all historians, and you're very well aware that maritime history, maritime heritage is a comparatively new field of study, especially in India. We haven't made much progress, and I would love to see the day when any of you or some of your students would take this forward. Now, what I'm going to talk about, the region that I'm talking about is Monsoon Asia. Let me come to define what is Monsoon Asia. The maps that you see on your
screen
screen
is not visible yet.
Oh, screen
Your
is not
screen is
visible.
not visible. No, ma'am.
Okay,
You didn't present.
okay. Okay, just one second. Then I'll just go back and yeah, okay.
Present now.
One moment. What did you say? Oh, present now.
Present now. Then you have to click over your entire screen. Then share.
Is it better now?
No, ma'am.
Yeah. So now I'm sharing the screen.
Yeah.
Not
now
yet.
it's yeah.
Now it's visible.
Now yeah, ma'am.
Okay. And now it is full screen. Huh? 1 second. I think I still need to get over this. And now it's. Are you getting the full screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that. Yeah. This is the region that is referred to as Monsoon Asia. And it is referred to as Monsoon Asia because of its unique wind system, which is the monsoons. You see the two slides on the screen. One shows northeast monsoon, which blows from December to, sorry, just 1 second. Let me get, yeah, from December to January, and the other is June to July. Now, the term Monsoon Asia itself is a term that was used in the 1930s. And it was first used by Paul Moose, a French Indologist, to refer to a region much larger than the constituting country. So it referred to Southeast Asia, all the way up to East Asia. And the term Monsoon Asia, as it was then used in the 1930s, also indicated commonalities amongst the cultures of these regions, all the way from Southeast Asia to East Asia, right? So this is a term which has come into use and is known to us from the early 20th century. Now, at the bottom of the screen, at the bottom on the left-hand side, you see it's a post-colonial context. And this is a context in which Sunil Amrit, the modern historian who works on the monsoons, has also written about migrations. He uses it. And he argues that the term Monsoon Asia in today's day and age should mean, and it should mean trans-regional connections and not necessarily a common culture. So there is a distinction between a common culture, which came to be termed Indianization in the early 20th century, and its post-colonial usage of Monsoon Asia as we know it today by modern historians, which is mobility, trans-locality, and trans-regional connections. So the question that I would like to ask you, and the question that I asked myself, is have we in India reached there? Certainly, historians of modern India are using it, but what about our monuments? How do we study monuments, and how do we use this term? So let me start briefly by talking about the term Indianization itself. And this was particularly used for Indianization of Southeast Asia. It was an idea which was mooted by French Indologists, Sylvain Levy, Jean Brzezinski. But the most important and the person who used it most frequently was George Sedez. He was an epigraphist, he was a Sanskritist. One of his books, The Indianized States of Southeast Asia, published in 1948, talks about Indianization and is really the foundational study both of Southeast Asia, and continues to be even today when we in India look at Southeast Asia. So much of our understanding has come from the way in which the Europeans perceived Southeast Asia. And I will come to much more to the monument as I proceed. Now, it's not only that the French wrote about it. In Calcutta, the Greater India Society was founded. It was founded on 10th October 1926, and Rabindranath Tagore was its patron. It also published 18 volumes of the Journal of Greater India Society. Now, I must say that many of the people who were members of the Greater India Society, they had at some point or the other studied in Europe. They had studied in France. They were also aware of French writings. They were knowledgeable in French. And the members of the Greater Indian Society were really historians, many of them based in Calcutta University, R.C. Mojumdar, Kalidas Nag, U.N. Ghoshal, Nalinaksh Dutt, P.C. Bagchi, and H.P. Sarkar. And there were many others. These are only some of the names who have published extensively. So clearly, there was a European connection, but there was also an Indian connection as well to the notion of Indianization, as we see it in the setting up of the Greater India Society. So where is the problem then? So let me tell you where the problem is. That even at the time of the Greater India Society, there were two perspectives or two parallel discussions which were happening among scholars. So one was, I have put the book out. This is the book cover of Indian Shipping by Radha Kumud Mukherjee. And as you will see on your screen, Radha Kumud Mukherjee in the frontispiece of his book, he shows you a ship, right? This is a ship in sail. It has 3 masts. And as you see in that circle that I have pointed out, the yellow circle, the ship had an outrigger. This is a special kind of device, a special kind of balancing device, which was used on ships. It was known as the outrigger. And what he titled this is not my words, this is Mukherjee's words. He showed this ship and he said, these are Indian adventurers sailing out to colonize Java, right? So the ship, for him, which was depicted, represented on a monument in Indonesia. The monument is on the island of Java in Indonesia. The name of the monument is Borobudur, but Borobudur has this ship representation, which Professor Mukherjee, Radhakumud Mukherjee, took and used it to argue that this is Indian adventurers sailing out to colonize Java. Now, that was one strand of the Greater India Society. But there was another strand. And I think when we talk about the Greater India Society, we should consider both strands, not one and forget the other. And the second strand was people like Rakhaldas Banerjee. Rakhaldas Banerjee, as you know, was an archaeologist. He also wrote a very interesting book in Bengali called Pashaner Kotha. I hope some of you have read it. It's the story of a stone on the monument at Bharut, on the Buddhist stoop at Bharut, and what the narrative, the stone tells of how it perceives what happened to the stoop. But Banerjee also was, Rakhaldas Banerjee was also not in agreement with the use of this kind of imagery to bolster what he said was Indian shipping. And in the quote that I have given at the bottom of your screen, he says very clearly, such an account of the Indian colonization of Java is obsolete and useless. And the reason for that, he says, is because monuments, and that is I have put it in, Borobudur in Indonesia, is a religious structure. So my question then is, so certainly Banerjee talks about Borobudur as a religious structure. Should it matter to us how we study it? Or can we use these selectively, whatever is represented on a monument, selectively to provide evidence for what we think happened or given the way we want to present our data? So I think that's an important point, which I will continue in this lecture. Now, this is Borobudur, as you know, and Sugato Bose has written Widening Horizons, where he talks about the travels of Rabindranath Tagore, who visited Borobudur in 1927. And here you see him on the steps of Borobudur. Borobudur is the largest Buddhist temple. So please remember that. It is a Buddhist temple. It is the highest temple in the world, not just in Southeast Asia. It's 31 meters high. Now, how did Tagore and how did many of the others who traveled to Southeast Asia, how did they perceive this whole question of Indianization? And how did they perceive this culture of Southeast Asia? And again, this, I think, is an under-researched theme. In the early 20th century, the promotion of the idea of an Asian cultural identity. And here, it was many thinkers, not just thinkers from India, but Japanese thinkers like Okakura Kakutsu, Indonesian thinkers, and many others who came to Vishwabharati, he came to Shantiniketan, who talked about the possibility, or even thought about a possibility of a sort of Asian identity and Asian cultural identity, which they saw in many ways as an alternative to European identity, as an alternative, if not an alternative, as something that the Asian countries could promote. And in this, they saw their regions within a universal history. So to Tagore and to many others, when they saw Buddhism, they were looking at a universal history and wanted to discuss India's role in that universal history. So again, what we see is a second strand, much like what Rakhal Das Banerjee was saying, that you have to look at the context, you have to look at the monument. You just can't pick off things here and there and use it selectively. And I would like to emphasize here at this point that this idea or these travels of these thinkers is, again, I find, continues to be under-researched. And this is not something which we have paid very much attention to. When we look at what was happening in the 19th and 20th century, much of our attention is what was happening in India, and not how many of the thinkers, how they traveled across the seas and how they brought back ideas which had an influence in India itself. Now, this notion of Borobudur, the Borobudur ship, which I started by showing you, continues to influence Nandalal Bose, who was, as you know, he taught at Vishwabharati, and he's also the person who made these drawings in the Constitution of India. So in the Constitution of India, there are drawings from history, and I'm sure most of you know that. But my interest is in the drawings of ships and boats. And on page 181 of the Constitution, under the oceans of India, I repeat, there are two drawings. The top one that you see is of a terracotta boat model. This is from Mohenjo-daro, the Harappan civilization. It's a 3rd millennium BCE boat, which was recovered after the archaeological excavations at Mohenjo-daro. And Mohenjo-daro, as you know, is now in Pakistan. And the excavations were really done in the 1920s. So it's an early 20th century model that we see here. The archaeological excavations were 1920s. And it's only in the 20th century that information on this civilization became available to people in India. And at the bottom of the screen, at the bottom of the page, on page 181, you see the same ship as you saw earlier in Radha Kumud Mukherjee's book. And this is the two-masted sailing ship from the Buddhist monument of Borobudur in central Java in Indonesia. So clearly, it was not just Professor Radha Kumud Mukherjee, but who looked at this as indicating the spread of Indian culture, but this was much more pervasive. The idea was much more pervasive, and but while the idea was taken up, the second strand of it, the quest for an Asian unity, or the quest for a context for the ship, that's a theme which got dropped by the wayside. So we took up the illustration, but did not take up the idea behind the use of that illustration. So I think there is a difference between the two. And hence, many of the people who wrote in the pre-independence under the Greater India Society, I think, need a far more sympathetic hearing than what has been given to them. And as you know, post-independence, by the 1950s, the society had closed down. The whole context of Indianization had been debunked. These historians were labeled nationalist historians, and what they wrote was forgotten. And I think this was, to my mind, throwing the baby with the bathwater. That fine, we threw out what their frameworks were, but we also threw out the scientific knowledge that they had collected. But wait, did we actually throw all of that out? We did not. I'm not sure how many of you have seen this, but if you've traveled to Mumbai Airport, pre-COVID days, of course, these days, or when you go next, hopefully next year will be better, please do look. The Mumbai Airport has lots of visuals. It has really been done quite well. It's known as the Public Museum at Mumbai Airport. And along with crafts and other things, you have this relief, which is replicated at the airport, and it is labeled Tribute to Indian Maritime History. Fine, but what do you see? You see the Borobudur ship. And as you see, there's the outrigger out here, the two-masted ship, the people on the ship, and so on and so forth. So I would like you to think and to really rethink this assumption. Does this represent Indian maritime history? And isn't it time that we move beyond and really thought in terms of decolonizing our maritime heritage? And have we done enough to question the ideas that we have inherited? To my mind, we have not. So let me move on. So fine, how should we then study monuments? And how should we then study the Buddhist monuments of Southeast Asia? Buddhism, as you know, was really discovered in the 16th century by Europe. The one way of discovering the ancient civilizations of Southeast Asia as was looking at the stupendous monuments that survived. In the 16th and 17th century, as European missionaries traveled, they labeled the new religion that they discovered as Buddhamatam, Buddha's point of view. And much of these writings were based on travels to Thailand, Southeast Asia, and also Tibet. And it is here within this, should one say, textual study of religion, the collection of manuscripts, the taking of these manuscripts to European libraries, the study of Buddhism based on manuscripts and literary texts. It is here that monuments then were considered really signifiers of an ancient civilization. They were then seen as sort of civilizers, which India provided to Southeast Asia. And the study of the monuments also, in my view, was seen through the text. So it was not an independent study of monuments on their own, but as seen through the textual tradition. So what does Borobudur look like? This is on the screen, you see a sort of general view of the 8th century Buddhist temple. On the map, the arrow points out where it is located. The other circles that you see on the map on the right-hand side, these are all World Heritage sites. And these are all sites which are of universal value, because World Heritage really symbolizes universal culture, universal values. But what is quite interesting and intriguing about the map is that you have all these red dots in coastal areas. But yet, none of those coastal sites is ever in dialogue with any other coastal site. These are all seen as national heritage. So I think there is a real problem in the way in which we term these World Heritage sites as universal, but yet not studied as a part of either global history, world history, but studied really as national history. And I could go on that, but let me not move into another direction, and let me not digress. So coming back to Borobudur, it is stupendous. It's a beautiful monument. It stands within green lawns, and it is very well maintained. But how did the Europeans discover it, and what did they write about it? So the one thing which is also quite interesting is that many of the Europeans who traveled to Southeast Asia were people who served in India. So Raffles, for example, Thomas Stamford Raffles, 1781 to 1826, he was also based in India, but then he was part of the British invasion of Java in the 19th century in 1811. And subsequently, for 5 years, he was the Lieutenant Governor of Java. Now, he was interested in the culture of Southeast Asia, particularly the culture of Indonesia and Java. Raffles' entire collection is in the British Museum. He collected a large number of bronzes from Indonesia, from manuscripts, and again, his collection itself is quite large. But what he also did is that he documented some of the monuments that he saw around him in Indonesia. He cleared them of vegetation, and he used this information to publish in 1817 his History of Java, the History of Java, which describes the ancient culture and civilization of Java. By 1824, Java had passed on to the Dutch, and in 1824, as a result of the Anglo-Dutch Treaty, British influence was restricted to the Malay Peninsula, while the Dutch took over the island of Java. And between 1907 and 1911, so early 20th century, Dutch engineers restored Borobudur. And again, there's a large, in Leiden itself, there is a large photographic collection of early photographs as the Dutch saw that monument at Borobudur, and the way in which they proceeded with the conservation. So here you see an early painting, which is in the British Museum. This was made in 1814. And on the left-hand side is the stone Buddha head from Borobudur, which is part of the Raffles collection and is again in the British Museum. So the making of collections is another story of colonialism, which I won't talk about here. But what is quite evident from the painting is the interest in the picturesque and the landscape, and the beautiful details and the greenery that the monument is situated within. So it's really certain aspects of the monument that got highlighted. One is the fact that it was a symbol of civilization, and another was the interest in the picturesque. Now, by the mid-19th century, the temple at Borobudur, it was European visitors visited the site, and an early photograph also shows this wooden deck that had been installed on top of the monument for visitors who regularly came to the site. But what is also interesting is that not only the Europeans and people like Raffles and others who took away sculptures from Borobudur, but also the Thai king, King Chulalongkorn, visited Southeast Asia. He also visited India, but in Southeast Asia, when he went to Borobudur, he requested that he should be allowed to take some sculptures from the site. And he was allowed to take 8 cartloads of sculptures, which are in the National Museum in Bangkok. And to me, this indicates the movement of these sculptures and the gifting of these sculptures as a way of cementing diplomatic ties with other Asian countries, and particularly with Thailand, is a way in which sculptures and monuments were used by the British, also by the French to a certain extent, and the Dutch. They were used for political purposes to really cement political ties. And Thailand was a favorite because Thailand was not colonized and it was independent, and the European powers wanted to sort of maintain that status quo and be on its, and it was seen as one of the true, or the sort of original Buddhist kingdom in Southeast Asia. And these sculptures, this is not the only data that I have. I've looked at ritual caskets and the way in which reliquaries were transferred to build diplomatic ties, and that again is another story. But Thailand comes out very prominently as a state which received a lot of Buddhist sculptures and reliquaries from the British and from the East India companies. Now, the Dutch also did a lot of interesting work at the site. And one of the ideas which came up earlier on was the idea that Borobudur, when it was built on an island, and that there was a lake in central Java. And you see this light-colored, light green area. And it was argued that there is a lake somewhere here, and the temple at Borobudur, which is marked here on your map, was in the shape of a lotus. And as the lotus floats on the lake, the temple was built on its shore to indicate the close association not only with water, but also should one say the symbiotic relationship with the environment and with nature. So at the time when it was proposed, this was not accepted, and people argued that this idea could not be supported. But subsequently, there are more recent studies, particularly studies of the ancient environment, paleo-environmental studies, which show that a lake did exist in the 9th century, though it was much more reduced in size. So clearly, when we are looking at Borobudur, apart from seeing its sculptures, there are many other perspectives that we need to draw in. Another is the whole notion of conservation, which again is an idea which interests me no end, especially after my stay in the National Monuments Authority, and the fact that when we restore or when we conserve, we don't conserve everything. We conserve what we think was there. So please remember, we conserve what we think was there. And so in a way, conserving a monument is as difficult, as easy, or as problematic as creating a past. But that is, again, something we need far more research on, particularly on Indian monuments, and particularly with reference to the whole discussion in South Asia. So what then was altered? The first thing that was altered was the landscape, right? We saw earlier that now Borobudur sits amidst nice green lawns, and there's nothing around it, which was seldom the case. Whenever Buddhist shrines, or even for that matter, Hindu shrines were built, there were subsidiary shrines around it. And we see this in many, many places that this was the case. But today, none of those subsidiary shrines exist. And archaeologists have investigated the area around Borobudur, and they have confirmed that within a 3 square kilometer radius around Borobudur, there were several Hindu and Buddhist shrines. So it was a much more plural sacred landscape when it was built. But today, it doesn't exist. All that has been obliterated. What you see on your screen are also stones from the site, that when the site was restored, they didn't know what to do with all these stones. So these stones you see in the site museum at Borobudur. So they're just there. We don't know where they came from, but obviously at some point, they were all part of the monument. At the time when it was conserved, when it was discovered, it had tremendous problems of waterlogging. And those problems have continued because it was never taken into account that it was at the side of a lake and that there was water seepage from the lake. But again, that is something which only recently people have come to realize or understand. So there are several problems which continue to persist even after the conservation of Borobudur by the Dutch, and especially the Dutch were important European powers who did that. Now, the other problem was that there are about 72 stoops on the topmost terrace, and you see the stoops here. And many of them were rebuilt because they could not find the original pieces inside this. Now, these stoops, as any of you who has gone there, and I'm really glad to hear that Professor Sen did go there, and so did Satadru Sen. There are Buddha images, seated Buddha images inside this, and I would really urge many of our younger colleagues and students to please do take a trip and do see Borobudur. It's a great site. So there are 72 stoops on the top terrace, as I said. And so you see there are images inside this. But again, we know from studies in India and in other places that these stoops were not just art pieces. They were just not for the aesthetics of it, but most of them enshrined relics either of the Buddha or of the monastic dead or of important people. We don't know if any of that happened at Borobudur, because when it was conserved, when these 72 stoops were rebuilt or redone, none of this was recorded, though the Dutch have recorded that some bronze images and coins were found. So we really don't know about what was enshrined as in this top terrace when the monument was actually built. So please remember, there are things we don't know about the monument. Now, let me go to the monument and the sculptures. And I had said that eventually we need to talk about the boat and what place does the boat have on this monument. So as I've said earlier, it was built in the 8th to 9th century. We don't have anything like this anywhere else in the world. It is unique to Indonesia. And this is a square monument. It has steps. You can see the steps, the school kids going up the steps. It has steps on 4 sides. So on all 4 sides of the square, sorry, not the square, the rectangle, you have these steps going up. And there are these various terraces. You can see the terraces that are marked here. But what is fascinating about Borobudur are the carvings in these galleries. You know, as you go, you then stop at terrace number 1, you go around the gallery and come back, or, you know, climb up again and then go around the second gallery and so on. And there are at least about 1,500, about 1,460 stone panels that are there, and about 500 life-sized Buddha images. So you can imagine the magnificence of the monument. Now, it is said that in the 15th century, it was abandoned. So certainly it was there between the 9th and the 15th century, and that in the 15th century, it was abandoned as a result of a volcanic eruption. I have put a question mark there, and I will address this. Was it abandoned? And again, this is something we've got so used to in South Asia that we talk of monuments, XYZ king building a monument, and then we never talk about what happens after the king dies, but the monument continues, and then we say at some point the monument disappeared or it was abandoned. What does the term abandoned mean? Does it mean it disappeared? Clearly it didn't. It was still there and it continues to be there. And what is also interesting is that when you look at the manuscripts, and particularly the Javanese manuscripts, they do refer to the monument. So there is importance of the monument well beyond when it was built and who built it. And in this case, it is the Shailendras, who were supposed to be kings of Java in the 9th century, who are supposed to have built it. There is some inscriptional evidence for that. But in the 14th century, actually, the Javanese manuscript, Nagar Ketagama, it refers to Budur and it refers to it as a Buddhist sanctuary. And then in the 18th century, as the chronicles, the history of Java started to be written, the history relates the history of Java from the time of the Shailendras, and they are seen as the dynasty that gave Java its identity. And again, there are references to the monument at Borobudur. So it did not disappear from memory. It continued to be enshrined in texts. It continued to be related to history and to many of the subsequent kings who came tried to draw their legitimacy from the Shailendra kings who built this Buddhist monument. And that is fascinating for many reasons. Indonesia, as you know, is a Muslim majority country, right? This is a Buddhist monument. And we again are so used to saying something is Muslim, something is Hindu, something is Buddhist. How do monuments get this religious affiliation? It's not very clear to me. And this is something which I'm questioning, that does a monument have this religious affinity? And the case of Indonesia really needs to be taken seriously in this regard. But I'll come to that. Let me continue with the visuals that are represented, or the reliefs that are shown. So like I said, that all the galleries, and this shows a sort of cross-section, where you see the several galleries from the first to the fourth gallery, and that there are illustrations or reliefs on each of these galleries. And scholars have, again, the way in which Buddhism came to be studied through the text, have always attempted to find some kind of textual evidence for these reliefs as to which text was represented here. So when you look at the textual evidence, you find that there are several texts. There's not one text. And the second point, which I would like to make very clear, is that there is no complete corroboration between a text and the relief. So the reliefs do not follow any particular text or all of the texts either. They do their own thing. So the artists were presenting the story of the Buddha or the life of the Buddha in his own way. But the one, and you see that at least at the Jatakas and the Abhatanas and the Jatakmala, and these date to different periods, and the Lalit Vista, these are not all of one period. But they relate to the life of the Buddha. So many of the lower terraces, they show representations of the life of the Buddha. But what is interesting for my purposes is this, the Gandhavyuha. And the Gandhavyuha reliefs, which are on the upper terraces. Now, I will come to why Gandhavyuha is important, but I also wanted to point out, particularly with reference to the point I made a little earlier, did it disappear in the 15th century or was it abandoned? And I've said that we do find it in literary references, but we also find it in Javanese cultural memory. And it continued as a center of pilgrimage for the Javanese. And there is an image, on the first terrace, which was identified as grandfather or Kake, and Bhima or Bhima from the Mahabharata. And this is what I find fascinating about studying monuments, the way in which believers or devotees constantly change should one say, the context in which they study the monument. We as historians cannot shift beyond one religion to the other. You know, if it's a Buddhist monument, we must look only for Buddhist texts to define it. But for a villager or a person, is fine. You know, if it's associated with Mahabharata, so what? And this is really fascinating about studying monuments with reference to the people who worship there and the devotees. So clearly, then there was this belief that Bhima or Bhima is worshipped for boons, and people used to regularly, the Javanese I'm talking about, used to make a pilgrimage to Borobudur. What we also know is that there are 11th to 15th century Chinese ceramics and coins have been found at the site. So clearly people from East Asia or other parts of Southeast Asia were visiting the site. So it was a center of pilgrimage, not necessarily Buddhist pilgrimage, but a center of pilgrimage and a devotional and a place of reverence and devotion. And by the 19th century, again, we have references that it was associated with the Ramadan, and that both the Chinese and the Javanese, they assembled at the site before starting the month of Ramadan. And of course, today, we also have Buddhists all over the world. And this is a ceremony in 2011. And these ceremonies have continued to be conducted, where it is seen as a unique Buddhist monument by Buddhists, not just in Indonesia, but all over the world. So let's get back to our galleries, and let's get back to the sculptures on the galleries. I had said that Gandhavyuha is a very important text for my purposes, not so much for the monument, because the monument also has other panels showing interesting scenes from the life of the Buddha. Why is it important for me? It is important for me because there are almost about 460 panels which show the story. The story of Gandhavyuha, which is a 4th century text. It went from Orissa to China, or the manuscript went. and then from China all over Southeast Asia, but also from India all over Southeast Asia. Now, the interesting part is that the text talks about a prince, and the prince's name is Sudhana, and he travels in search of knowledge. And he's really looking at how to get knowledge. And so this text, it's not a historical text. So by no means am I saying that this is a historical text which we can trace where the prince traveled, or the historicity of the prince for that matter. What I'm saying is that the quest for knowledge, the quest for traveling, the quest for mobility, for translocality, this is a quest which plays an important role in the vision of Borobudur, primarily because there are almost 460 panels which talk about this story or this narrative, which is certainly a spiritual narrative, but it is also a narrative that takes place in the world. And as the reliefs show, they talk about ordinary people. Prince Sudhana, he is advised to meet these 45 spiritual friends to learn bodhicharya, or the bodhisattva practice. But what is interesting is that who are these teachers and who are these friends? So the teachers are not necessarily monks and nuns, but they're also kings, hermits, merchants, ship's captain, and so on. And they're ordinary people. And the text clearly says that everybody has something to give. And if you talk to that person, you get something, you learn something. And it is this quest for knowledge. So the knowledge is not defined only as religious knowledge, but really knowledge which certainly promotes bodhicharya, but is also knowledge to be gained from ordinary people. And there are about 126 panels which show this pilgrimage. Just two scenes. There are many more. So this is the prince you see with the parasol, and he starts on his journey. He's got an elephant along, and the gods are throwing flowers on him. And again, he goes to various teachers, and eventually it's Maitreya that he finally needs to find, the future Buddha, to get his spiritual knowledge. And as part of these reliefs, what becomes very obvious is that the artisan or the sculptor shows actual life of what living in 9th century Java was like. And that's the unique feature. These are not stereotypical depictions, but very vibrant and dynamic depictions of travel, of translocality. And here you see, this is Prince Sudhana in a gesture of humility, and he's trying to listen to Bodhisattva Samantabhadra, who talks to him about Buddhist practice and meditation. And again, I find it really fascinating, not just the exquisite details of the dresses and the features, but also the vibrancy of this whole panel. Now, since we are talking about translocality and mobility, Java is an island. So anywhere that you go from there, you have to go by boat or ship. And sure enough, if you look at Borobudur, there are about 11 boats and ships which are represented. I had shown you only one when I started with that ship with the Outrigger, which I started the lecture with. But there are many more. In all, there are 11. And this is to be not surprising, given the fact that what we are looking at is a monument on an island. This is something that is to be not surprising. And the outriggers that I said, there are 5 ships with outriggers. And this is typically Javanese construction. So the outriggers we don't find in South Asia. So claiming them to be Indian ships just doesn't work. There are several contexts within which these are depicted. I'll just show you a few of them. But please remember that there are both ocean-going vessels, the ships with outriggers. There are also river boats, and these river boats are depicted in scenes from the Buddha's life. And there are also ocean-going vessels which refer to the story of the navigator Suparaga, and I will show you that in a moment as well. This is a story which is from the Jatak Mala. It is a story where the merchants traveling overseas, they need a navigator. And again, this is something which comes across in Buddhist Jatakas and Avadanas in quite a big way. The fact that you need a navigator, just like a navigator guides a ship across the waters, one needs a navigator to reach or to reach the end of the spiritual journey. So clearly, I mean, you could as well read it as a spiritual journey. But what I find interesting is the fact that these spiritual journeys are presented as actual real life travel across the seas. And that's the interesting part. And second point that I would like to make is that the number of boats and ships which are shown at Borobudur, it far outnumbers any other Buddhist monument in the entire world. We have many monuments, and certainly at Ajanta, one does see some boats and ships, but not as many as 11 that are shown in Borobudur. And that clearly, as I have said, if you live on an island, then you certainly need some water transport to get from one place to the other. And these boats and ships are shown as part of life at sea. So this is an interesting scene. Here at the bottom of your screen, you see this monster, the sea monster. He's got his mouth open, and he's trying to devour this ship. And then at the bottom of the screen, you see the waves. The waves are here. There are the fish. The one sailor has already jumped out of fear into the water. And this theme of a sea monster, the sea monster we see also at Indian monuments. We see it at Bharat in central India, and we also see it other sites. And there are stories in the Jatakas which talk about the problems that one faces as one travels across the seas, and sea monster is only one of them. The turbulent waters and the waves are many others. So this is an interesting scene which shows the sea monster trying to devour the ship. A second story, and which comes up in the Avadan and also in the Jatakas, is the fact that the Bodhisattva, the Buddha's, the future Buddha, he takes several avatars, or he comes in the guise of several animals and humans to save his devotees. And on many of these journeys, when the sailors were wrecked or were in dire need, they used to pray to the Bodhisattva, and the Bodhisattva appeared and saved them. And here you see there is, if you can see, this is a turtle. It's a huge turtle. This is the mouth of the turtle. This is the body. And you see the claws here of the turtle. And all these sailors, you can see this man is clearly in trouble, distressed, and they are all climbing onto the turtle, and the turtle saves them from shipwreck. And this is a story which is not only very beautifully depicted at Borobudur, but also occurs in the Kachapavadana as an avatar of the Buddha, and the Bodhisattva appearing as this giant turtle to save his devotees. Now, also I said that Sudhana was told to meet many of his teachers, and one of the teachers was a mariner, the mariner named Vaira. And this shows the mariner guiding the ship, and this is one of the teachers that Sudhana goes to meet. It's interesting that a mariner should have been brought into this whole discussion of quest for knowledge, quest for teachings, which only specific individuals could provide. And here in this depiction, you see the outrigger again, the outrigger prominently depicted at the bottom of your screen, and then the waters underneath it. The navigator Suparaka, who was taken by merchants on board because they wanted some guide and they did not want to be shipwrecked and did not want to suffer being devoured by those monsters. So here we see inside that circle, we see the standing navigator Suparaka. Suparaka was said to be blind, but the merchant said, well, never mind, but your knowledge is so great that it doesn't matter to us. So please do accompany us, which he did. And we see him pouring libations, and this is a spouted vessel, which he's using to pour libations into the waters. And at the bottom of the bottom, you see the waters of the ocean. But the interesting point is that most of these narratives, in addition to Sudhana's travels, get linked up with many of the Buddhist stories that are there in the Jatakas and the Avadanas. But of course, the most prominent depiction is of this ship, which you have seen earlier. There are 5 such ships which are shown with this outrigger, and you see the outrigger again. And these occur in galleries 1 and 2. They are shown both with masts. You see the masts here of the ships, but they're also shown with oars, and certainly the oars were also used to guide the ship to the coast, and that was a device that they used. And this is a person who's got on in front to scout for land. So these are very interesting scenes, which indicate a deeper knowledge of the seas, of the waters, and of shipbuilding. And I have already said that outriggers are really a characteristic feature of boat building in the Indonesian archipelago, and not even all of Southeast Asia. So they're very specifically Javanese and also Indonesian. And another point that I'd mentioned is the detail to sort of life around that these reliefs show. And you can see it on this hut, which is built on stilts, and the birds on top, the dresses. So it's in the guise of depicting Buddhist narratives. What also comes across in these reliefs are indications of life on the island. And these outriggers and these ships have, like I said, they have raised a lot of controversy and debate. Initially, they were thought to be Indian ships because it was, like Professor Sen said, as part of the civilizing mission, it was thought that the natives could not sail, and it is only the civilizers who had the ships and could bring culture to an island. And this is, I mean, all of us who study South Asian history are familiar with this theme. The Romans coming to civilize India as part of Roman trade, or the Greeks with Alexander civilizing India as part of the Greek cultural expansion. So it's not surprising that we thought of the ship as a civilizing technique to Indonesia, following the model already set up. But the Indonesians thought otherwise, and so they, in 2003, they actually built a replica of this Borobudur ship with outrigger. You see this replica here, and it sailed from Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, and on the north coast of Java. It was built to prove that point, it was built by Indonesian shipwrights. You see the outrigger here, which is in this marked in the yellow circle. And this actually sailed. It sailed under Philip Beale, and there are accounts of this sailing from Jakarta all the way to Africa, just to prove the point that these were seaworthy, and also to prove the point that these ships were Indonesian ships, which were actual depictions of what was on the ground. So clearly then, the interest of Borobudur is much beyond just looking at Buddhism in Indonesia or in Java or in the king, the Shailendras, but it is in looking at interconnectedness and interconnectedness across the seas. And let me highlight the fact that this is not something which is known only from Borobudur. We do know of travels across the seas by Buddhist monks. And there are accounts both in Chinese biographies, in sources, in inscriptions. So for example, the first point being that the Buddhist monk Vajrabodhi, he spent 7 years at Kanchipuram. And again, I would also like to point out another thing. When we think of Buddhism, we think of North India. But Buddhism was a major continuing practice in large parts of peninsular India and Tamil Nadu, which we do not research and do not talk about. So to get back to Vajrabodhi, he lived in Kanchipuram, which had a big monastic complex. From the coastal site of Nagapattinam, he sailed with Persian merchants for the Indonesian archipelago. And then he spent 3 years in Sumatra. And then after that, he went to China. And Vajrabodhi is known also as introducing new forms of Buddhism and introducing ritual bronzes, many of which are found in Indonesia and have been collected over the years. Another teacher was the Dharma teacher Atisha, 10th, 11th century. He's again a major figure for the spread of Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism. He studied in Bihar at the Vikramshila and Nalanda monasteries, but then he traveled to Sumatra, where he studied with a famous teacher, and then came back and took Buddhism to Tibet. So there are many teachers like Atisha, like Vajrabodhi, who indicate that what is depicted at Borobudur, the quest for knowledge, the travel, and the mobility was not such a strange idea. It's just that we as historians have not paid enough attention to it. And I would also like to include the district of Nagapattinam in this discussion for the fact that, like I said, that we don't discuss Buddhism in peninsular India. We don't discuss Nagapattinam as a place where several Buddhist images have been found. You see Nagapattinam on this map of India, which is the nose jutting out. This was a district which was which was damaged badly during the tsunami, but is also known as the district which is rich in fishing communities, fishing villages. And it has a large number of Buddha images, seated Buddha images. You see this on the right, life-size image in granite, one of the stones found in Tamil Nadu. But the interesting part is that this image that you see on your screen was found not in Nagapattinam, but in Sumatra, which is at Kotachina, which is you see the arrow and the map of Sumatra. The northeast coast of Sumatra, and the site of Kotachina is a coastal site, which has not just yielded Buddha images, but also Hindu imagery, inscriptions, Tamil inscriptions, so on and so forth. So clearly there is a lot of data on mobility, on translocality, which is available. The point is we need to look at it more closely. And the final two, in the final part of my presentation, and as I close, I would also like to highlight the fact of memory, of the way in which each succeeding generation configures its own perspective on monuments. And this is a sculpture. It's a beautiful sculpture of Borobudur. If you land at Jakarta Airport, you would see that sculpture. And this is a sculpture made by a Balinese, Nyoman Nuarta, of not just the massive scale of Borobudur, but also the fact that it is so light and it's so appealing that it just dissolves. And it is he has also been awarded the Padma Shri in India, but the fact is that Indonesia values and promotes its heritage, which may be of any religion, but it does not really matter. And my final slide is what I would like to conclude with: the way in which all monuments, and I would like to emphasize again, all monuments are multi-layered. Let us not devalue them, and let us not restrict them only to looking at who built it and how much land was given for building this monument. Let us look beyond the afterlife of monuments. Let us look also at the way in which we look at these monuments. And if we look at Borobudur, for example, I can give you several perspectives. The Buddhologists, and there's a lot of discussion amongst Buddhologists who look at Borobudur through texts. And they say this is a monument affiliated to Tantric Buddhism, and it is a mandala. And they quote several texts, several Tantric Buddhist texts, which refer to mandalas and which refer to stups as being built on the plan of a mandala. So to the Buddhologists, this is a monument built as a mandala, and it's affiliated to Tantric Buddhism. If you look at art historical writings, and there are again lots of them, they refer to the aesthetics of the monument. And they refer then to the monument as it was constructed in the 8th, 9th centuries. And they discuss in great detail the commonalities or where it comes from. Is it Southeast Asian? Is it Javanese? Is it Indian? If it is Javanese, how was the influence? How was it internalized, and so on and so forth. So it's a completely different dimension that they look at. For the Europeans, I have already said it was a picturesque ruin covered with volcanic ash. And it was a ruin which they discovered, which they documented and conserved in the 19th and 20th century, and which they saw as a remarkable reminder to Buddhism, which don't forget, in the Victorian period, Buddhism was seen as an ethical religion. And so Borobudur was considered as a reminder of this ethical religion, which spread across the world. But the locals, how do they see it? They see the Chandi, which means a temple, as a guru, and they see it as hikmah. Hikmah is really wisdom from Allah. And the locals, as I've already argued, it's a Muslim majority country. And fortunately, and I'm very pleased to say that it is not defined in religious terms, and it is defined as local and national heritage. It is a World Heritage Site. The Republic of Indonesia has, and you can see the emblem at the back. This is a local Indonesian family visiting Borobudur. At the back, you see the symbol of it being a World Heritage Site. And World Heritage Sites are usually made of the monuments which achieve or which are inscribed on the World Heritage List are really monuments which have universal value and which are admired universally rather than locally or nationally. But after the creation of nation states, post 1950s, all the monuments have come to be seen by the nation states as national heritage rather than world heritage. even though there's a lot of pride in inscribing monuments on the World Heritage List. And unfortunately, we as historians have not seen or have not studied them for their universal values, for their translocality, mobility, and all the rest that I've been talking about. And the last point, which I would like to continue to emphasize, because I just feel that this is something which we need to, sort of really go beyond. Indian visitors to the site see it as an indicator of the spread of Indic culture. And I really think we need to research. We need to bring in the perspective of the Greater India Society, the second perspective, not the first, of the universality, the Asian identity, the mobility, and thinking behind the making of the monument. So for me, the fascination of Borobudur is that it is a multi-layered, not just Borobudur, I would argue that all monuments. And that is something which I would urge all our younger scholars and researchers to please bear in mind, that these monuments are really multi-layered and they need to be studied as such. And with that, I would end and give the floor back.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Now the floor is open for question and answer, and the audiences are requested to put their questions, comments, or observations if they have. I also request to my friends over the Facebook Live. Please put your questions or comments or the observations over the chat box. We will take it. Neil Lohit. Neil Lohit, go ahead.
Thank you, sir. And first of all, ma'am, I'd like to thank you for this amazing lecture, ma'am. It was so enriching. And I have a question, ma'am, and I think it pertains to the modern geopolitical concerns in the area. Do you think that given the ongoing and emerging Indo-Chinese geopolitical conflict in the Southeast Asian region, that it might hinder the decolonization of scholarship in the region, ma'am?
Thank you for that interesting question. And I completely agree with you that we cannot study heritage monuments outside the geopolitics and outside the concerns of the present nation states. But you would also have known that one of the pillars of the geopolitics in the South China Sea is the Maritime Silk Route, which China has promoted. And China started with the overland route, the Silk Road, as it said, across connecting China to the Mediterranean, right? In which they argued that silk from China was being supplied to the Roman Empire. So the connection was between the Han Empire and the Roman Empire. Now, you as a historian, and all of us know that the Silk Road was never a road. This is something which the Europeans, the German geographers, came up with in the 19th century. So the point I'm making is, so clearly, the Silk Road, the overland road was accepted, UNESCO accepted it, it continued. Now China has started in a big way talking about the Maritime Silk Route. What are the arguments being made? The arguments are being made that the Chinese traveled all the way from South China, which again, this is very problematic historically. The control of the coast by the kingdom, which is based inland, but China has used very effectively heritage, Buddhism, geopolitics to talk about the Maritime Silk Route and the travels of Admiral Zheng He, the 15th century traveler. If you actually look at Zheng He's travels, there are very important aspects to it, which I'm sure you know. Zheng He himself was a Muslim. the people who traveled with him, a lot of them were Arab Muslims, right? And China had a large population of Muslims along the coast, which a lot of it was massacred and so on and so forth. I don't want to go there. But when he comes to India, where does Zheng go? He goes to Bodh Gaya. Why does he go to Bodh Gaya? You know, so the point that I'm trying to make is that geopolitics is a very important part of our life. Archaeology has always been a discipline, a political discipline, I would argue, involved in the politics of the day and age. Now, why in India we cannot do any research on any of this is what beats me. And if we don't do research, if we don't come up with alternatives, what gets spread? The Chinese version. Okay? So why on earth are we still so keen on talking about Indianization and not doing, not learning languages, not doing our research, and not coming up with alternative narratives? I hope that answers your question, but I do feel very strongly that Indian researchers and students should take a much more interest in Southeast Asia than has happened up to now.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Another guest is SM Jha, sir. SM Jha.
Namaste, ma'am. Yes, namaste, ma'am. Very thought-provoking lecture, ma'am. Do you find any impact of Java culture on India? That is the first query. And second, we have the tradition of boat making there in Java. Do you find any such tradition of artist who is making the such architecture there? Tradition of artists in Java, influenced by Indian artists?
Okay, your first question was, what is the Javanese influence on India? Now, the first point I would like to make is many of the ideas in Buddhism, especially, the ideas. No, first let me start by saying that if you look archaeologically, India doesn't have tin, okay? And yet we made bronzes. Where's the tin coming from? And it could come from Afghanistan, yes, but all our Chola bronzes are made down south. So just in terms of the materiality or the commodities, we do get it from elsewhere. The second point, in terms of ideas, several scholars, and a lot of the recent younger European scholars are arguing that Vajrayana Buddhism developed on Java and then came to India. So this is again another very important discussion that's going on in the field globally. Now, I would say that given the fact that there is so much going back and forth, when Atisha goes from Nalanda, studies in Sumatra, comes back to Bihar, then goes to Tibet, surely, why did he go to Sumatra for 3 years if he had nothing to learn, but he does. And now you have to read his writings very carefully to know what he has picked up from there. So in terms of of both religious ideas and the history of ideas, I would say there are many, many influences which need to be highlighted. And certainly various developments in Buddhism, particularly in Buddhist thought, are significant in this regard. Sorry, what was your second point? You said one was you said Javanese influence and
both.
Yeah. Do we find any other places in Indonesia where boats are depicted? Is that what you were arguing?
Not only that, even the artists making of temples and all, local tradition of artists there.
Certainly, I mean, Java is a place which is rich both in textual tradition and in sculptural and tradition. And yes, if you generalize and if you say Prambanan is a Hindu temple, fine, but it's not the same as any temple in India. So clearly there is a local tradition of temple building. Prambanan has major depictions of the Ramayana, but it's not the same Ramayana as in India. Okay. So there are, I can go on. There are many, many differences, which there's a lot of literature today which does talk about these differences, which does talk about representations, local literary idiom. Javanese becomes a major language of writing in the 9th century, which is fairly early, right? And they're writing the Ramayana, the Javanese Ramayana in the 9th century, which is very different from our Valmiki Ramayana or the other Sanskrit works. So yes, in Indonesia, in Java, there is evidence for both literary production, but also artistic and sculptural representations, which highlight the local knowledge and really the local skills. It's only that we need to pay more attention. I hope I've answered. Thank you.
Ma'am, our next question from Riddhi Bhattacharya. Riddhi, are you here?
Good morning. Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
First of all, I would like to thank you, ma'am, for your wonderful presentation. I would like to ask that, ma'am, as you have said, that Borobudur consists of a story of Kachapa Avatara, where the drowning merchants from a shipwreck were saved by the Avatara, which is considered as an avatar of Buddha.
Yeah.
And the same story continues in Dashavatara of Vishnu, written by Jayadeva in Gita Govindam. So, is the two stories are same? The incidents are same, or there are two different stories with the same storyline?
Thanks. Great question. There are several overlaps between different religious traditions. Okay. And you're right that one of the early avatars of Vishnu is certainly Kachap. Now, in that avatar, Kachap, the avatar, it holds the Mount Meru while, in the churning of the ocean was churned between the Devas and the Asuras. And they used this Mount Meru for churning the ocean. And so Kachap was on the base, and Vasuki was used as the rope. And then out of this, all the various treasures and jewels came. I would not say borrowing. I would say that if you look at various representations of the way in which the seas were conceptualized, then you see certainly overlaps, because the churning of the ocean is a fascinating example of the way in which the ocean was conceptualized as a place for treasures. After all, what came out of the churning, what came out were the treasures, not just for immortality, but also medicine, also many. Now, where is all of this coming from? Where is churning of the ocean coming from? And there are many. The churning of the ocean becomes very popular in Bangkok. Even today at Bangkok Airport, you see that the whole narrative being depicted at the airport. So my answer would be that we should look at overlaps. After all, we as historians look at silos. We say, oh, this is Hindu, this is Buddhist, this is Jain, this is Islamic. But the people who are coming up with these are all living in the same part of the same tradition. And even if you look at temples, or if you look at Orissa, for example, many of the architectural features between Buddhist and Hindu monuments are borrowed wrongly, or is what we say, but have overlaps. So I think that we need to look more at overlaps rather than borrowing. But thanks for the question.
Ma'am, our next ready is the MD Faraz Ali. Faraz, are you here?
Yes, yes, sir. A very good morning, ma'am.
Good
First of
morning.
all, thank you for carrying out these beautiful arguments and discussions. I had a question that, do you think that the Islamic influence in Indonesia has somehow obliterated the existence and dominance of Sanatan and, the Buddhist ideology in that place in general?
You mean
As
at
we
present?
saw,
At
yes, ma'am.
present or in the past?
Yes, ma'am. At present, ma'am.
I'm not so sure I would be agreeable, because Indonesia accepts 5 religions. I hope I'm right about the 5 religions, but they certainly accept more than one. So they're not a secular country, but there are 5 national religions in addition to Islam. And Buddhism, Hinduism, I'm not sure, I think, what the others are. But, there is a ministry of religions, and the ministry, gives earmarks funds for this. So I'm not sure I would agree with you on that. That it has been overshadowed. But I would say that if you talk to Indonesians, they would say this is part of our heritage, right? They don't view it as religious heritage. They don't say Buddhist heritage or XYZ heritage. So they see it as their heritage. And not in terms of religious affiliation, and which is what I think is also what prompted Indonesia after its independence to promote Borobudur as a World Heritage Site. And you must also remember that in the beginning, Borobudur was in a bad way because of waterlogging, and Indonesia appealed to UNESCO to provide engineers and to provide funds for the protection of Borobudur and for the conservation of Borobudur, which UNESCO did. And I think it also sent people from India, the Archaeological Survey of India, to help with the conservation. It was, I'm not sure that it can be seen only in religious terms, because like I have said, the texts that I quoted are not Buddhist texts. These are all Javanese texts. And I think that would be my response to your question. But thanks.
Now I request to Professor Mridu with her queries or the comments or the questions, whatever she has.
Thanks, Celine. Thank you, Professor Ray, for a wonderful lecture. I wanted to ask a question relating to your larger point about the politics of archaeology.
Mm-hmm.
And in that context, how does the UNESCO designating, and it does it all over the world, how does it designating a site as a World Heritage Monument work in terms of removing it from the locality in which it's been preserved, given new meaning, as you've shown so wonderfully? I mean, so, even with Ramzan, it can be, the celebration of Ramzan occurs around the same site, etc. But do you think, that of course, the UNESCO taking over or choosing to preserve a monument means funds, and it's all very good from a conservation perspective, but does it remove or freeze the meaning of the site itself? And I'm asking this in the context of the very contentious story of the destruction of the Banyan Buddhas, right? And I can't remember who argued this point, but I thought it was actually really interesting that, in fact, part of the objection of the Taliban at the time was that, designating the Banyan Buddhas as, aside from the iconoclastic drive of the Taliban itself, that designating it as a World Heritage Site removed it from the locale of Afghanistan. So in some crazy way, there was also an assertion of the ownership of the shrines at the same time as, of course, they proceed to destroy it. So, I mean, I'm just very curious about what the UNESCO does in terms of how the meaning changes or maybe doesn't of these sites. Thank you.
Okay. No, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Great question. I would completely agree that, let me first start by saying I completely agree that the way things are, let me put that caveat in. The way things are, making it a UNESCO World Heritage Site removes it from the local context. But that's not how things should be or were envisaged at the time that UNESCO was set up. Because if one reads the history of UNESCO and the way in which the founders, the reason why they set up the World Heritage UNESCO listing, they saw it much more in terms of archaeology and history. Okay, and of course communities and local communities and all that. Now, somewhere down the line, archaeology and history got dumped. And who took over? Conservation architects took over. So this created a kind of, even in our country, even in India, a kind of divide between conservation architects and historians and archaeologists. And as you know very well, where are we studying UNESCO World Heritage listing? Where is the public debate? I mean, it doesn't exist because historians don't study that. They don't see it as of relevance to them. So now with the focus on conservation, and there's a second focus, which is tourism. Why is a site made World Heritage? It's made because, tourists will come, money will come, there will be new hotels, all of that. More money. More revenue for the governments. So, which really means that now, what do you need? Why would tourists come? Tourists would come if there are big hotels. Tourists would come, if there are facilities, all of that. Now, what do hotels do? They take away from this good work which was done by scholars for Agra. And they showed how, Agra is a great example, right? Taj is the sort of grandest World Heritage site. It brings in a lot of money. What does it do for the local economy? Nothing. The money goes out. So I completely agree. And I also agree that the first people to be removed from the site are the locals, because they obstruct this beautification. You can't have the lawns, which is all our monuments also. You can't have the lawns, you can't have the greenery, you can't have the big hotels. If there are all those fellows selling, knickknacks. Now, Indonesia has done it in an interesting way. So there was a lot of furor in Indonesia on the removal of the locals. So what they've done is they've designated an area where the locals can have their shops and they sell their souvenirs. So when you come out of the way the exit is, so when you come out of the monument, you have to go into that area. You cannot bypass that. And so, if the tourist wants, they can buy whatever. So, but this is my frustration and my also something which I feel very sadly about, that it's not the historians or the archaeologists who are studying this. This is being studied for tourism purposes. So what would tourism, what would people all over the world like to hear? Not what the monument signifies. And I think that's one of the major arguments against a UNESCO World Heritage nominations, that on the one hand, they're talking about universal values of, universal aesthetics, but on the other hand, these values are only for the well-heeled and the rich who can travel. I mean, it's not you and I who are, providing the money. It's the Europeans and Americans coming with a lot of money. So I agree with that. But also, you see, now, afterlife is always complicated to, bring in. you know, it's much easier to say, oh, you see, this is the oldest monument, this is the biggest Buddhist site. Afterlife, that is for historians or for people who understand, you know. For an ordinary tourist, doesn't matter.
Right.
So I think there is a lot to be said. While nation states, I can see why they, even we do. We've got 30, right now 37 or 38 World Heritage Sites. Point is, these are seen only for revenue, for tourism,
Yeah.
and much less for their, you know, for local. For locals to digest or to, you know, to come and visit, and I think that is where I think historians should play a much bigger role than they have, and that's why I thought I would talk to all of you, you know, to say hello, you know, I'm really said by this, do something, you know. But thanks for the question. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are there any more questions? No. So now I officially requested Professor Navraj Rafiji to officially come ending this program.
Thank you, Dr. Javed. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Navras Hafridi. I serve the Department of History, Residency University, Kolkata, as an assistant professor. And I appear before you on behalf of the Department of History, to express our gratitude to Professor Karbi Sen for her generous